Um, so with that, our first presenter today is Roberta Gordaoff with her presentation, the Unangax, Defying Stereotypes Since 9000 BP. So we'll go ahead and make Roberta a co-host here. So Roberta, you should have co-host capabilities now and able to unmute yourself, share your screen, and get your presentation going.
Okay, can everybody see the screen and the presentation? Yeah, okay. So hi, I'm Roberta Gordaoff. I'm a PhD candidate here in Tromsø in Norway, and I'm studying the Aleutian Islands. So today I'm talking about kind of some of the differences in how the Unangax are framed within the hunter-gatherer literature. And generally, they are ignored in a lot of the literature, even though they're one of the really, a really great example that can be used for ethnographic analogy, since it's the same people living in the same area for thousands of years without a whole lot of change environmentally, and then also with very little influx until much later on in time. So the oldest midden known in the Aleutian Islands is about from 7,800 to 7,200 cal BP. And generally over time, the same species are found the entire length of time until the present, although kind of some of the preferences for species change over time. So generally, the Aleutian Islands are put as a kind of ranked below kind of the Northwest Coast societies, and how the very large populations in those areas and their really heavy reliance on fish, meaning you can get a lot of people grouped together that are concentrated on one species that's only available sometimes. And one of the things, along with the ranking of the Northwest Coast, is these matrilineal societies that have this really high emphasis on research ownership and descendant groups. And as you can see on this chart here from Marley Conway and Piper from 2016, they're kind of ranked in between the Eskimo or the Nupiaq, kind of the more northern societies, and the Northwest Coast societies. But I think that there can be an argument made for the Aleutian Islands actually being a bit more dependent on descent groups than has previously been recognized. And you can see this by looking at some of the census records. So this copy here is from 1897. And as you can see, it lists by name all of the residents. This example is from Chernovsky, and it has where they were born. And as you can see, the majority are born in Chernovsky. So there's this really close connection between families and places. And I think that that can show how these same areas are being used by the same people, and that can go back through time. So here's another example of kind of this tie to place. So in this example is from 1879, the census on the left. And then here's an example of some of the family ties. So starting in 1897 and going all the way through 1920, you see the same family living in Chernovsky. So you really see this tight bond between place and families. So that was the first one was from 1879. The second is from 1897, 1900. And then from these census records, you can also get some really good detailed demographic information that is not available in a lot of other places. So here again, the census record from 1879, and it has the names of the people, at least the names of the men, and then the ages. And so you can actually look at who was living in the Aleutian Islands during those times. So here's a chart of the men and women living in the Aleutian Islands in 1879 and 1897. And you can see that there's generally more females than males. So you can actually look at village compositions and age compositions and by male and female. And so here's again by each of the villages from this 1879 and 1897 census. And I use these because they're the oldest census information that includes names, ages, male or female, and by village. So here you can see women are on the left and men are on the right on these charts, and kind of how the villages were composed. And something that's pretty unique about the Aleutians too is there's this, because of the food resources they're using, the intertidal resources, everybody, all age groups are able to access food. And so you see a lot of the elderly population in the Aleutians that you don't see in a lot of other hunter-gatherer societies, in part because they're able to continue contributing and are less dependent on the younger populations. And so something else that we can look at if we're thinking about villages and lineages is looking at where people are living. So I looked through the 1897 census, and this is from kind of the Eastern Aleutian Islands, in the islands, not so much on the Alaska Peninsula. And I looked at all of the marriages that were identified in 1897, which included where everybody was born. And so the patriloquial are where the men, where the husband lived in the village, and then the wife did not. Matrilocal is the wife was from the village, but the husband was not. Neolocal is neither husband or wife were born in the village. Local, they were both born in the village. Single people, and then indefinite, where it wasn't really clear if they were married or not, or if which village they were from. And some of the villages have a much stronger local population than others, but there's not really a clear indication of one form being preferred over another. Something else that's really important to consider when we're looking at the Aleutian Islands is how maritime-based the populations were. And so there's very little there's much less reliance on where you can get to by foot and a greater reliance on where you can get to by boat. So this was taken from Veniaminoff from the 1830s, and his indications of travel time in hours by kayak from different places. And you can see that some of the places are much closer together in time that it takes to kayak there. And you'll see a greater reliance between those villages having stronger relationships than places that are farther away. One of the things that it's constantly repeated in the literature is that the Eastern Aleutian Islands, the Fox Islands, had greater population densities than elsewhere. And this seems to be true, at least by the 1879 and 1897 census, where you see a much higher population in the Eastern than the Western. So this historic groups were numerically, as they go up, you get farther west. So one would be the Alaska Peninsula and the Shumagon and Snack Islands. 2 is the easternmost island, Fox Islands. 4, 6, and 7 are missing from these charts because they were depopulated by the time of these census were taken. And you can also see, you also get information on how many villages at different times were located in each of the areas. So the graph here, the chart is from 1791, and it's one of the earliest census records that at least have the number of villages identified. This particular one is from the Fox Islands. So as you can see in Unalaska, there was at least 16 villages in the 1790s. And so that information from the 1790s can then be compared to the archaeological information. Here's a graph with the known, the identified AHRS sites on Unalaska Island. And each of the colors is by density of sites. So you can see there's few areas that are much denser. So these areas were preferred places within Unalaska Island. For example, you can see here, this is where Chernovsky is, and it seems to be a higher density closely in this area, whereas some areas have smaller places. And I think that you can look at these density of sites, and even though we don't have very good chronological control of sites, we can at least get spatial control, and we can look at these denser areas and look at them that are close together as being territories. So they're places that people are accessing continuously in these limited areas. And then the black stars are the identified historic villages. So you see they relate pretty closely to where the archaeological sites are as well. So you're seeing this continuity in place again. And then so here's this Chernovsky Bay area. So if you remember from the last slide, it's this kind of western end of Unalaska Island. And here's all the sites in this area, the archaeological sites, the prehistoric sites. And so you can see that they're really using this complete area. And that can contribute to how the land is being used over time. And by looking at where these concentrations of sites are, you can start delineating territories, I think, within the Aleutian Islands. So I think that there's a lot of really good data available from the Aleutian Islands that hasn't really been incorporated in a lot of hunter-gatherer literature. And especially since it's such a good example of a maritime culture, they're living in the same areas. They haven't been marginalized into kind of the outskirts or pushed out of an area by other groups. You see this continuity in environment as well. You see the same species being used over time, the same places being used over time. So I think that there's a lot of really rich literature here that can be added to the broader discussions of maritime hunter-gatherer economies. And that is everything that I have today. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Roberta. Well done. We still have several minutes here. It's just 9:13 by my count. So if anyone has any questions, I didn't add this in the intro, but you can type them into the chat box. You should be able to chat directly to Roberta or myself or Monty if anybody has any questions.
Hey, Roberta, this is Monty. I got a quick question. So around these ancestral village sites, the different archaeological sites, are you seeing some commonality or differences in the types of sites around these villages, depending on the territory, or are they all pretty similar?
They're fairly similar. It's pretty hard to tell. The data isn't well defined. So we have a lot of site location information, so we know what areas are being used and kind of how densely they're being used, but we don't have a lot of information otherwise. Some sites may have a description, but a lot of them are just location information. So it's hard to tell.
Fair enough. Yeah, I hear you there. I was just informed that the chat is disabled, so I'm working on getting that enabled here quickly. There's apparently a plethora of questions.
Okay, I think I just checked the box that should allow that to happen.
Yep. Let's see. So it looks like folks would like your email, Roberta, for follow-up.
Yeah, I sent that.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, so one of the questions was there seems to be a lot of concentration of sites on the northern coast of the island, but not so much on the southern coast. And part of that is, yeah, there hasn't been a lot of surveys, and a lot of the literature, at least the historic literature, has said everybody lived on the north side of the islands. The south side wasn't so important. And if you look at site coastal complexity, the number of bays and inlets on the island, you tend to see a lot more concentration of sites in those areas. And the southern side of Unalaska isn't quite as jagged as the northern half, so that could be part of it. But there are some pretty good sized villages of the ones that have been identified on the south coast. And then there's a question if I'd looked at the Russian church records. No, I have not. A lot of them I think haven't been translated. And I haven't been able to look at them, but that is another really good source of information that I hope to look into later. So there's another question about inland sites. Yeah, so the interior of the islands generally haven't been excavated, haven't been surveyed even. There's been a few projects in the Central Aleutians on ADAC that's looked specifically for upland sites, and those sites tend to be the problem is that few people have looked at them. There's not really a consensus. Like they're not all for the same purposes, these upland sites, but they've kind of all been grouped together just because the interior of the islands haven't been surveyed. But you can get some pretty large sites. The site that we worked on ADAC that Diane Hansen led in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, there's at least 28 houses at that site. So you get fairly large sites of the upland as well.
One more question here from myself. Is there LiDAR availability for out there for some of the islands or no?
Not very much. There's some, there's a little bit for the eastern Aleutians, but there's very little for the central or the western. So there's a question about the examples that I used on the census records was also the last name Gordaoff, and yeah, that's why I used it. My family is from Chernovsky area, so I think it's really, I've been really fortunate to be able to work out there. I was able to go out with CRC and the Corps when they were doing some cleanup in 2019, and I was able to go out and survey that area. And so the example that I showed of the sites in Chernovsky Bay, they had been surveyed once in the 80s, and that was it. Nobody's visited those sites since then. So I was able to go and get a bit more detailed information on those areas. And so once I've identified the kind of these concentrated areas by the site density, I think you can start looking at those as territories and looking at how you can apply that to other areas. And so the Chernovsky Bay will be a good example of how to do that, since that has been really well surveyed. And then there's another question about historic gardening to supplement the diet. There's some talk about local foods that were really important as carbohydrate supplements to the maritime diet, but I don't think there was any like specific gardening. Although you can see at some of the prehistoric sites, you start seeing vegetation from different areas that are mixed at the sites. So people were bringing in plants to the site. So plants that wouldn't normally grow in the areas where the sites are being found there. So there was a bit of use of plant resources as well, but it's just, it's not very well documented. Although there was, Holly Thorson did a paleoethnobotany study on the upland site there on ADAC, and that came out, I think, this year or last year, so 2020 or 2021.
All right, great. Thanks, Roberta. So yeah, we're up against the clock here. Great questions, everybody, and great presentation, Roberta. Thank you.